Hello, all, and welcome. My name is Ayana Wallace View. I'm a training and technical assistance manager with Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. I am really excited for the start of this new June series, our Ujima Talk series, where we're going to be focusing on community violence and community response. And this first episode is actually going to center domestic violence lethality in the Black community. And I'm joined today by one of my Ujima family members, Millicent Phipps, who is Ujima's Director of Legal Programs. Thank you so much, Millicent, for joining us for this Ujima talk. I'm really glad to have you.
Thank you for having me, Ayana. I'm
Of
excited to
course.
be here.
Of course, of course. So, Millicent Phipps is the Director of Legal Programs, again with Ujima. We're the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Ms. Phipps has more than 20 decades, or sorry, not 20, 2 decades of experience providing technical assistance and training that addresses the intersections of domestic violence and firearms. Before joining Ujima, she served as the director of the National Center on Protective Orders and Full Faith and Credit at the Battered Women's Justice Project. Millicent was also a staff attorney at the American Prosecutors Research Institute, the Training, Research, and Technical Assistance Division of the National District Attorneys Association. She is a graduate of University of Washington School of Law and is also licensed in the states of Maryland and Washington. So again, thank you, Millicent, for joining us. You're going to bring a lot of good information, a lot of good context to the conversation. So, you know me, we're a jumping type of people over here. I wanted to really start out with talking about, how did you get into domestic violence work? And for you, why was especially focusing on gun violence and firearms important?
I really had to think about this question, not just because I've been doing this work for decades, but just trying to remember what motivated me, young me, undergrad me, to want to choose the directions that I have chosen for my career. And I go back to certain things that kind of pointed me in this work and guided me to keep on doing this work. And the first thing is, I actually was encouraged to apply to law school and go to law school by a female attorney in Seattle who was one of the first people to be admitted to the University of Washington School of Law. So she wanted to encourage other women to become attorneys. And she had hired me when I was an undergrad. I actually could type really fast. So I was a transcriptionist and I used to type her motions and other things. And then she would mentor. There were two of us. She was mentoring us and encouraging us to go to law school. During that time working with her, we unfortunately had a client who was seriously injured by her spouse. She actually was set on fire.
Mm,
And during the 2 years that I was doing this work and then applying for law school, there was a lot of litigation that came up in that relationship. And it ended up actually, she argued in front of the Court of Appeals when I was in law school, and we all went and saw her argue. It was very cool. But it really showed me how IPV can affect people's relationships because the attorney I worked for was a family law attorney. So we saw IPV raise its role in our domestic violence, in our domestic relations cases.
mm,
Then, my first job in law school, I actually worked in the special assault unit, which was all crimes against women and children. So it was felonious assaults, including homicides. And that allowed me to not only provide research and assist in jury selection, but allowed me to actually meet families that were coming through and really see how the criminal justice system works. I
mm,
then went and did misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence and other misdemeanors at the city attorney level. Before I moved out, obviously this work was in Seattle, Washington, and then I moved to the East Coast where I was able to take that prosecutorial background and work for APRI. So I was doing then training and technical assistance on OVW related grants that helped prosecutors. So we were doing, any type of TA and training for prosecutors to help them understand domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence. I then went and did quite a long time, probably a couple decades, where I was managing the National Center on Protection Orders and Full Faith and Credit. And because people who are subject to qualifying protection orders are not allowed to purchase or possess firearms or ammunition, and then people who've been convicted of misdemeanor crime of domestic violence also are prohibited, We would maintain information on state and federal domestic violence related firearms prohibitions and also train basically the world, anyone who is involved in protection or system, about the existence of these prohibitions. We also would work with survivors in that job because survivors would have access to civil court issues or protection or enforcement issues. So we were a TA provider that actually did have a responsibility to survivors. And then I decided to focus more on issues that involve Black women and girls and came to Ujima, where we also have grants that allow us to work on domestic violence, lethality related issues, and
Mhm.
domestic violence homicide related issues. So that's really why I kind of, all of my jobs have this kind of nexus where it involves IPV and or the use of weapons. It's not just one job, it's kind of all of them woven
Right.
together have made this career.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, when one job led you to the next, led you to the next, and you saw all those different connections coming in. I think
Yeah.
that's fantastic. Yeah. So when you think about your work, what's
Mhm.
the first thing that you want people to understand about domestic violence lethality?
It's important to understand that domestic violence lethality doesn't really come out of nowhere, that
Mhm.
there often are warning signs. Unfortunately, a lot of times we don't know the warning signs fully until after the homicide has happened in a fatality review team, or we're looking back to see what kind of history involved the parties and what has happened. But
Mhm.
lethality is often predictable because there are warning signs, because behaviors happen. If we look at the behaviors holistically instead of singly, we can actually see that there is a high probability of lethality. So, like warning signs like access to firearms or
Mhm.
stalking, strangulation, threats to kill, if violence is escalating, when partners are forcing sex, if there's obsessive jealousy, and even recent separation and unemployment, all of these things are warning signs that can actually show a higher lethality. It's also
Mhm.
important to understand that survivors often recognize danger and dangerous signs before systems do. That doesn't mean
Yes.
before advocates do, but before the civil or criminal justice system might think that there's enough evidence to get involved, evidence to charge, or enough evidence for a civil protection order. Survivors often do appreciate the absolute reality of the situation that they're in. We also know separation is frequently one of the most dangerous periods. So when somebody does file for a protection order or they decide to leave the relationship, whether it's go to a new house or just leave and end the relationship with a partner,
Mhm.
that can be a very dangerous and highly lethal time for a survivor. So it's important that we really focus on the patterns and the behaviors and the course of control rather than each isolated incident, because that does give you a fuller picture of lethality.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking, a lot of folks will still say it felt like it came out of nowhere. We recognize, the person lost their job or they had
Mhm.
been, having a tumultuous relationship, but not putting into full context what that actually means for someone's risk of harm or risk of death. Yeah.
Right.
So how does, and you've already sort of started working us through this, but how does gun violence impact domestic violence survivors and specifically Black women survivors?
So we do know that firearms access increases danger. It increases the chance of a lethal interaction. We also know that firearms do limit options because gun violence will change the entire safety equation for survivors. Firearms, out of all of the weapons, can turn a threat into a serious injury or a death in seconds. Other
Mhm.
weapons are not as lethal as a gun. So, unfortunately, Black women do experience disproportionate rates of intimate partner homicide. Research has shown that. And there are many reasons, but Black women do navigate multiple risks simultaneously. So there are economic barriers and economic considerations, there's community violence, there's racism, and then we have to look at the impact of systemic barriers that may influence survivors' help-seeking behaviors and decisions. It's
Mhm.
not that everyone feels comfortable accessing systems. There can be previous history and interactions that really could make someone not want to interact, not call 911, not want to interact with prosecutors, not even want to get a civil protection order just because of other experiences that have happened with the system. We
Hmm.
also know that survivors can also feel increased violence from their partners because if you're going to address the firearms, if you want to remove the firearms, if you're going to address the violence, sometimes there is retaliation. And then overall, we know that sometimes Black survivors are not treated well by
Hmm.
the institution when they do want to get help. And that negative institutional response can impact somebody's safety planning and their ability to utilize systems to have a positive outcome.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned, even just the access to firearms can increase a survivor or a victim's potential risk for homicide. Can you walk us through a little bit more of like why that is? Why is it not just possession, but the access to as well?
Well, start with that firearms are many times used to intimidate or to threaten people. They can be used as monitoring behavior, right? We can use it to, have someone comply.
Mm,
Also, the threat of having a firearm used against you can isolate somebody. If you do this, I will use the weapon. The weapon doesn't even have to be fired to create this fear or compliance or reaction in survivors because someone who has access to a firearm can very quickly utilize that and escalate their behavior. So we know that guns are frequently used to intimidate or coerce or stalk, but like examples of how they're used to get this compliance, someone can take their firearm out during an argument and on its face to say, I'm just cleaning the gun. But if you have a very volatile emotional situation going on and someone takes a gun out and just starts to clean it,
hmm
that can definitely be perceived as a threat. And if this is something that happens continually, every time we get in an argument, the gun is taken out and put on the coffee table. Every time we get, in an argument, the batterer threatens to kill themselves or threatens to kill someone else.
hmm
You
hmm
also can have just a display of weapons trying to discourage someone from leaving. If you leave, I might have to use the gun. These kind of uses are not the firearm being shot. It is just what happens in the use of weapons to try and intimidate or coerce the behavior.
Absolutely. And that makes a ton of sense. Like you don't even have to, aim the gun at
Right,
the victim to still intimidate and still cause fear. So absolutely.
right.
So when we talk to the community about escalation, about
Mhm.
risk, how do you talk to them so that they're really, again, understanding the full picture of what a survivor might be experiencing?
So when you're talking about risk, it's important to think about it in a very easy framework. Risk is going to mean the possibility of serious harm. Risk
Mm,
is the chance that something can happen. But when we talk about escalation, that's when we're talking about something a little bit more concrete and the abuse is becoming more severe or more frequent or more unpredictable. Escalation really means that abusive behaviors are becoming more dangerous to the survivor. So there's a difference between the two. Risk is chance, and escalation is the increase in dangerous or abusive behaviors.
hmm
Both equally serious.
Both equally serious, yeah. But I think that's a really good way to frame it for folks of like, there are certain inherent risks that a survivor will face,
Mhm.
and these are the ways in which we sort of measure, how their risk is increasing or not through the
Right.
escalation. I love that. So, what type of barriers might, and you've already, sort of given us a couple gems, but what other type of barriers might, or maybe just go into more, barriers that might prevent a survivor from disclosing the threats of firearm or talking about how a firearm was used in an assault?
There are a few that I don't think I've mentioned yet. Sometimes there can be community pressure to keep matters private.
Mm,
IPV involves relationships, and we keep it in the family. We don't want people to know what's happening. We don't want systems to get involved and know. So this community pressure can be a barrier. Fear of
mhm,
retaliation from not only the partner, but also from family members if you are seeking help, if you are using any type of outside, even community-based support, not just systematic support,
mhm,
the families can also retaliate. There are many economic dependence considerations. If you are wanting to involve the criminal justice system, but your partner is the one who economically supports the family, if
Mm,
you even something as simple as firearms that are lawfully purchased are expensive. So if you're going to surrender something that's expensive, if you're going to give away something that's expensive, there's economic consideration even in that.
mm,
Housing issues, um, if you have firearms in violation of your lease or your rental policy, if you are calling 911 and getting assistance, and then now you are going to be subject to a nuisance ordinance. You
mm,
can then have a survivor may have a negative housing outcome. Getting the system involved, be either civil or criminal, sometimes can have child custody concerns. Having weapons around children may have the survivor subject to a referral to Child Protective Services for
mhm,
the possession and presence of weapons around children, safety concerns, things like that, which now may have the survivor involved in a completely different system.
mhm,
And then I
mhm.
think I already talked about retaliation and distrust of institutions. I do want to make it clear that these are safety concerns for survivors. They are not personal failures of survivors. These are more systemic and societal failures, and they are
Right.
not a reflection on decisions that survivors may make.
Absolutely. And thank you. I thought those were really, really great tangible examples for folks to really process through, especially when they're doing safety planning. So this is kind of a layered question.
Mhm.
But can you talk us through, because I know folks are starting to see some of the connections, but can you talk us through the relationship between mass shootings and gender-based violence, and then also community-based gun violence and IPV gun violence?
So, as you mentioned, these topics, there has been research about mass shootings. So when we're looking at mass shootings and how they occur, sometimes they're the school shootings and the other shootings where multiple people have actually been, unfortunately, murdered through firearms. In looking back, a lot of mass shooters, not all, but
Hmm.
many, have a history of domestic violence or family violence or have exhibited stalking behaviors or coercive control. It is not everyone, but
Hmm.
it is some. There are domestic violence related homicides where it is just a murder suicide or just a murder where it is the person who's caused harm has now, injured or killed the survivor and then themselves. There are many of those instances. But when we're talking about mass shootings, there has been found to be a nexus.
Mm.
When we're talking about community violence and intimate partner violence, they really shouldn't be viewed as separate issues because community violence and IPV related gun violence can overlap through many shared risk factors, and those include trauma, firearms access, and systemic failures. And that is why when we're talking about these things, we can't just put them like, oh, that's just community violence or that's just
Hmm.
IPV related gun violence. We have to look at them holistically and focus our prevention efforts to address both intimate partner violence and community level violence. Because by doing that and addressing them both simultaneously, we actually have a reduction in violence.
Yes, absolutely. And so thinking about different tools and different pieces that are really important to bring into the work, can you explain to folks what a lethality assessment is and
Yes.
how it may be used to support safety planning or even a criminal legal response?
There are many jurisdictions that use lethality assessment or risk assessment tools. That is a name, but they do have more formal names. But what they are just a series of questions that are designed to identify factors that are associated with risk of serious injury or homicide. Series of questions that the survivor answers, and then they are scored. And this score or the result of the assessment is then utilized to support safety planning and system intervention. It is not a score that says you are going to be killed or you need to da da da. It is a
Mhm.
score that says you are at risk or there's high lethality. So, examples of some of the tools there's the DA or danger assessment, there's the lethality assessment program or Maryland Lab, sometimes you hear it called. There
Mhm.
are many other tools. They all are validated, meaning the questions have been created, there's been research that has been done, and they're validated When they've been validated, they help identify elevated risk, they help improve safety planning, they help support legal advocacy and firearm relinquishment efforts, and they would help inform criminal legal responses. Because some of the danger assessment or the tools are done by law enforcement, some are done by advocates. So it depends who's doing it, where the information goes. Now, some of the
Mhm.
negatives about the tools are you have to be trained. You
Yeah.
can't just have a series of questions and start asking people questions. They are actually created by researchers. The tools have a format. Not all of them ask about the presence or use of firearms, but many do. So they will say things like, does the person have weapons? Or does the person have firearms? Has the person utilized a firearm against or towards you? They will ask other
Mhm.
questions, has there been a recent lapse in employment? Things like that. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer. Another issue about lethality risk assessment tools is confidentiality.
Mhm.
So, in the actual response from the survivor, if the survivor is providing responses to law enforcement, there's absolutely no confidentiality. Those responses can go to other people as well as the prosecutor. The advocates who do lethality assessments would have confidentiality. So it's really important if you're looking at utilizing a risk or lethality assessment tool that you know that you're trained, you know the purpose of the tool, and that you also are very clear with the survivor about the limits of confidentiality because
Mhm.
survivors do not have to answer the questions. It is absolutely up to them whether or not they want to participate, but they need to know the framework and the limits of people's confidentiality before sharing, especially because survivors may share about their own weapons possession
Mhm.
or purchase of firearms, and not everyone purchases firearms lawfully.
Right. Yeah, informed consent, folks, please. Like, lean all the way in. Like, we really
Yes.
want to make sure that we're supporting survivors in the way that's going to be safest to them. So please lean in. And thank you for that very concise explanation. I love the, quick, gentle reminder of please be trained when you're using these tools. Please don't just
Yeah.
jump in. Folks, you can be very well intentioned and still unintentionally cause harm when we're not really leaning into advocacy the way we need to. So get connected to a program, get connected to other advocates in the field, get connected to, folks that really just know what they're doing so that survivors have some safe options.
And with that, I will say, if money is going to be a consideration because training and purchase of the tools oftentimes is not free, that's
Mm,
also something that people need to know. There are a lot of resources out there, but not all resources are free and not all access to the resources are free. So if you are interested in utilizing a lethality or risk assessment tool in your jurisdiction, you need to make sure that you have the funding to provide for training of either the advocates and or law enforcement and to purchase access to the trainers.
hmm Absolutely. And so, what type of, well, actually, I want to stick to safety planning a little bit.
Okay.
So I've heard, even as an advocate, and I know a lot of survivors will hear things like, again, from very often well-intentioned law enforcement of like, well, you can get a gun too. Or other advocates of saying, well, you can get a gun to protect, or the community, right? Of like, Joel, just get a
Mhm.
gun. Why is just going to get a gun not efficient when it comes to safety planning, or not like the marker of what safety looks like for a survivor?
It's such a loaded question about whether or not survivors should arm themselves. And I'm answering this with just facts about the situation, not a judgment on whether or not survivors should arm themselves. But things to consider are that additional firearms may increase risk.
hmm
So when we talked about, a few minutes ago about the presence of firearms increases the risk of domestic homicide, it doesn't matter who purchases it, who has act, who. So if the survivor purchases, you still have the risk because the weapon in the home is the
hmm
risk. You can also be disarmed. If you have a weapon and you are not prepared and or trained to utilize it, you may be disarmed and the weapon could then be used against you.
hmm
That is problematic. You could also be criminalized. So when you purchase a weapon lawfully, you are seeing many things on the firearms form, and you also are responsible for that weapon. If you give the weapon to somebody else and that person's prohibited, that's a crime. If you
hmm
give access to the weapon and then they use it, that's a crime. If you purchase an illegal weapon in many jurisdictions, that's a crime.
Hmm.
So there are things to talk about. If you are working with a client or someone who wants to get a gun, it is important to safety plan. So, safety plan and have a realistic discussion about purchasing the weapon, safety plan about utilizing the weapon,
Hmm.
encourage the survivor to get trained in the use of the weapon. They have courses that will teach you how to shoot and things like that. They actually have courses even just for women. So
Yeah.
if you feel more comfortable in a course that is broken up by gender, they do have trainers. They have female trainers and they have trainers who are classes that are just for women. But you have to utilize multiple strategies. Safe storage. You have to
Hmm.
make sure that children and other people in the home do not have access to the firearm. You also have to talk about just the broader issue of safety is not that survivors have to purchase a weapon to be safe. It is really safety is about support and planning and resources and accountability, not just weapons.
Hmm.
So we know that survivor safety is centered on comprehensive planning. And that comprehensive planning is connection to advocates, connection to attorneys, creation of personal safety plans that are continually revised,
Yes.
including the survivor's changes in circumstance. None of those factors in this whole idea of safety require you to get a weapon.
Hmm.
So it's a really important to think of getting a weapon is it could be a tool in your safety toolbox. It would not be the overall avenue of keeping yourself safe.
Right. Absolutely. And again, folks, safety planning, you should continuously be updating safety plans, like
Yes.
every day, even a couple hours, depending on the intensity of the situation. So
Yes.
definitely great points for folks. How can family and community members stay safe while also supporting someone who's at risk for gun violence?
I would say the first thing is to be open-minded and listen without judgment. I know that it can be hard to hear that a family member is in a situation where they're being subject to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. But to be supportive means to really be present without judgment. I
Hmm.
think that family members who are not practitioners that deal with IPV need to avoid confronting abusive partners, and people who work in this field wouldn't confront abusive partner. They're going to look for resources, but it's really important to not confront the abusive partner because the survivor could be at increased risk of um, or increased danger by that confrontation. I think that family members and friends need to try to, as they're listening without judgment and be supportive, really try and get the survivor connected with resources. So
Hmm.
community-based advocates or any type of professional that can help. It could be clergy, it can be other members that are trained that can be supportive to the extent that friends and family can be supportive in safety planning.
Yeah.
I think that that is also important. They can help develop safety plans. There might be things that they think of that the survivor might not think of, like, oh, don't forget the daycare, the school, or work, or, just things. And also by having that discussion with supporters about safety plans, it also helps supporters have an idea about their own safety
Yeah.
because sometimes the violence does escalate and it does encompass family and friends and other members. So
Mhm.
when we have a disclosure that someone is in a highly lethal situation, the family members should also think about their own safety and maybe create their own safety plans as well. And
Yeah. I
also,
think
as we're
that's,
creating the plans and doing these things, protect the survivor's confidentiality. If they
yes.
are confiding in you as a friend or a family member, this does not mean it is a TikTok story and it should be out there for the world. They are confiding because something is happening, and we want to support people and we want to encourage that they have a support system in place, which means protecting their confidentiality unless you are asked to make a disclosure to someone.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I love that. It's so layered of like you can be a support and be a space of safety and make sure that you're safe as well.
Right?
And I love the piece about when community and family really support a survivor in their safety plan, they're also sometimes inadvertently safety planning for themselves, which
Right.
when we're talking about gun violence should absolutely, I think, be factored. family and friends. I even think, there have been a couple news spotlights of family
Right,
trying to show up to support a survivor or a victim of violence, and then them being exposed to the gun violence as well. So
right.
safety planning, folks, is really important. Again, getting connected to folks that do this work, to even think about just very simple safety planning strategies that we often overlook.
Right.
And so we've talked a lot about, the work, about advocacy. What does a culturally specific response to domestic violence lethality look like? And I'm specifically thinking about your work under Ujima, where we're a culturally specific resource center, but what does it look like to do culturally specific lethality work?
I think that you start with the premise that culturally specific it's going to include culturally specific advocacy,
Mm,
trusted community partnerships. It includes an understanding of systemic barriers, and then you have to utilize a survivor-centered approach that absolutely recognizes the experience of Black survivors. So that's what you're starting with. And then the characteristics are you're never going to stray from it being survivor centered because anytime we create a system where we think we know what's best and we do not get input and think of things from the survivor framework or experience is not going to be the best system.
hmm
You also need community involvement. So anything that's created needs to be community informed. We have to look at the specific community or communities involved, and then we have to get feedback as well. We have to understand trauma response
hmm
because anytime we're dealing with IPV, we have to understand trauma response and we have to understand how to do trauma responsive care. We need the program to be grounded in Black cultural realities.
hmm
And most importantly, we need to connect to trusted institutions and culturally specific organizations.
Absolutely. And so that being said, folks, if you have questions on how to make your response culturally responsive, Millicent is one of our go-to people on how to get y'all together. And so my question sort of stemming off of that of just community response in general, what would a solid coordinated community response look like to you?
So you would have collaboration of all the groups, right? So you're going to have advocates and culturally specific community organizations. You're going to have courts and law enforcement, and even think more broadly, healthcare providers, community violence intervention programs,
Hmm
and really you need survivor leaders. You have to include survivors because your coordinated community response needs to involve survivor feedback.
Yeah.
And once you create something, you have to have a mechanism for the community to provide input and feedback on the program and be able to revise based on that feedback. So, although you can have a broad group of partners, you really do need to have mechanisms where survivors get feedback,
hmm
community-based programs get feedback, the culturally specific organizations give feedback. And when I'm saying include culturally specific organizations, I don't mean at the back end after the
Right.
program has been created and then, hey, can you come to a meeting? I mean, culturally specific organizations are at the forefront providing input and equally speaking on the platform and the product that is getting developed. Everyone needs to be at the table from the beginning. It can't be something that's created by courts and law enforcement and they're leading it and they're creating something that is like criminal justice based and everybody else has to get on board. Everyone
Right.
needs a voice. And then there has to be the ability to listen to the critiques. Because in
Mhm.
order for a system to really work or a coordinated response to really respond to a community, we need to listen to what the community says and get that feedback because ultimately it will increase survivor safety and offender accountability in the creation of that type of system.
Absolutely. And so, are there any resources or just pieces of literature even that you would highlight for folks or suggest that they read just to know more about the subject?
Well, I would highlight us because I do think that we do have expertise where we can help people. So if you have a technical assistance or training request, I hope you would reach out to Ujima. We also have some resources involving firearms and domestic violence, like we have a firearms fact sheet and things like
Mhm.
that that we can provide. I would also, if you just want to understand firearms a little bit and see what the issues are, Everytown for Gun Safety, they have everytown.org has a website where they have information that's in lay people terms. It's not too legal. I mean, you can go down a legal rabbit hole if you press too many
Mm.
buttons, but it on the beginning parts, you can really see what is happening. But what I like about every town's website is you can click on your state. So you can
Okay.
click on your state and you could see, oh, what do firearms on campus look like? What do da da da? And it will provide information that you can understand. For people who are interested in extreme risk protection orders, and those are not available for everybody. They're only in 21 states that have them. But if you're
Mhm.
interested in extreme risk protection orders, then I would say Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. They have the National ERPO Resource Center, which is just erpo.org. It has everything you could want about extreme risk protection orders and how they can be filed and who can petition. In the 21 states where you do have statutes that allow for that, some of the statutes do allow for advocates and family members to petition. So the extreme risk protection order would be a mechanism to have the firearms removed from the person. It is not the
Mhm.
same as the prohibitions for civil protection orders, but they also provide TA at the ERPO Center, which might be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so one of my favorite questions to end with. If you were able to snap your fingers, Thanos style, let's say, and make, a drastic change in the world, what would your one change be for survivors, and what would your one change be for folks doing gun violence prevention work?
Okay. For survivors, especially for Black survivors, I wish that they would be believed and protected and supported and provided meaningful options for safety.
Hmm.
And by that, I mean options outside of the criminal and civil justice system, too.
Hmm. Hmm.
For gun violence prevention professionals, my first thought was I wish there was no job because that means we actually have addressed the problem in this country, but that's a little too Pollyanna. Um, So for gun violence prevention professionals, I hope that we can keep domestic violence and IPV central to the prevention conversations, that we can acknowledge the relationship between domestic violence and firearms, because that is going to help prevent intimate partner violence and save more lives.
Hmm. Hmm. I love that. Thank you, Millicent, so much for joining us. Millicent's always down for my shenanigans. I'm like, hey, come do this
This
for
was
me.
fun.
Yeah, this was fun. This was really great information. I loved everything you shared, especially around safety planning and just community response, community accountability. So folks, stay tuned for more upcoming Ujima talks. We have the rest of our June series coming shortly. Stay tuned for our upcoming webinars and coffee and combos, and we'll hope to be in touch with you soon. Follow us on social media. We're at Ujima Community pretty much everywhere. Reach out if you have questions, reach out if you want to connect, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.